It does a bit. All right, so we are. Although I guess that last time it was online. Yeah. Yep. All right. I've been a mess every day the last.
I was up till 2 o'clock this morning studying for a major biology test that I had today. Yeah, chapters. Straight up biology.
I'm not looking forward to biology. I love it, but everybody is like college biology.
Nope.
Okay, so we can talk about biology another time, right? I'm sure it's on everybody's mind, but want to remind everybody that for next time you are reading the Thomas Hobbes excerpt from Leviathan, right? So a couple of things to keep in mind. Like one, it's just a short excerpt. It's about 5 pages from a much, much longer book. It's the most famous chapter, the one where he kind of makes his basic argument. But yeah, remember that the excerpt is from something larger. And also, it's going to be difficult to read. Now, I think that what you've been given so far, the Dhammapada and the Confucian philosophy texts, like I think that like maybe the style of argument is difficult, but by and large the vocabulary hasn't been, right? With Hobbes, the vocabulary and the sentence structures are going to be kind of difficult. So read slowly. You may need to read it more than once. And just make a lot of notes while you're reading, right? Look things up. Make sure you can identify what the subject is of every sentence and what the verb is. And that will help you understand what's going on there, right? But yeah, I'm just want to advise everybody to go slowly and take a lot of notes because it's going to be a lot harder than a lot of what you're used to reading. It's just it's 17th century 17th century political philosophy, so it's written written in the style of the time. Okay, so does anybody have any questions about anything before we proceed? All right. Then let's talk about Sun Tzu. How'd this go for you? What did you guys think of this?
Okay,
Okay.
if I'm going to be completely honest.
All right. Well, I guess I'm asking you sort of more to one, point out any difficulties you had with it, or just if there's anything that you want to say about the arguments he's making, or.
I make notes.
I got what page is it on?
Sun Tzu is on page 71.
I'd say his was the least interesting
Okay.
to me.
Okay. Why did you find it less interesting?
But I think I'll be biased because I just don't agree with him. He's
Okay, so part of it is like you read like that first sentence where he makes the argument, you just kind of shut off like, no, I'm not. Okay, and this is one thing that we have to try to learn. It's hard, right? It's difficult to do. This is one thing we have to learn not to do, right? We have to learn to consider the argument sympathetically before we decide whether or not we agree with it, right?
Well, I agreed with some points and disagreed with them, and like I said, it was still pretty boring. It was pretty. It wasn't as interesting, and it could have just been the person's. What's the word I'm looking for?
The style is a lot.
Maybe.
The style is a lot more dry than the other two, right? So the Dhammapada, it's not structured the same way, right? It's not structured like an argument. It's these kinds of like little aphorisms that build on each other, right? And the Mencius is a dialogue full of poetic metaphors, right? What we have here is essentially a structured argument, right? He states a thesis at the beginning, restates the thesis in just about every paragraph, and every paragraph is devoted to an example that illustrates the thesis, right? So Sun Tzu is advancing a clearer argument than the other two were, right? There's more that is explicitly stated here and less that is implied. And I think we also need to bear in mind that he is arguing from the same basic set of assumptions that Mencius is. From the same cultural position. They're writing in a similar period, although Sun Tzu is slightly younger. So he's responding to Mencius's arguments rather than the other way around. But let's step back for a second and remind ourselves what this Confucian background looks like, that they're both writing from. What do we remember about Confucianism from last time? Because it's always good to go back and review where we were before we talk about where we are, right?
If I like a set guideline of rules.
Yeah, it's very rules oriented, right? Yeah, order is very important.
Enlightenment was thrown in there. I don't know notes. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Self-awareness, that kind of.
Okay, and how would a Confucian define self-awareness based on what we said last time?
Yeah.
Pardon?
Isn't that like enlightenment?
Well, I think that probably applies a little bit more to Buddhism, right? And Buddhist enlightenment is about, learning that basic fact that desire causes suffering and pain, right? And so teaching yourself not to desire things. What's the metaphor that Confucians use to describe life, the universe, and everything? What do they compare society to?
Are that like cups and bowls and like willow?
Yeah, the cups and bowls and the willow wood, that was like Mencius's arguments about human nature, right? That human nature is the willow wood, right? And cups and bowls are what, human nature can be shaped into. But yeah, you're right, yeah. So society, for a Confucian, is a ritual, right? So we remember how this works, how the metaphor works? Yes?
Okay, what I wrote down was the belief system that promotes stability in
Mhm.
life or in life is a ritual and everyone has a part.
Yes. Society is a ritual, right? Everyone must play their part. So that means you show deference to your social superiors and benevolence or generosity to your social inferiors, right? People who are below you on the ladder.
And they also believe that like if everybody didn't play their part, everything would come like crumbling down.
Yeah, so this comes out of a period like what's called the Warring States period in Chinese history. You have an empire that has just fallen apart, and you have all these little petty kingdoms that are kind of vying for control. They're struggling with each other. And so what this is an attempt to create order in a disordered world, right? By getting people to think about their bonds to each other. So Confucianism is always about the bonds people have with others, right? The debts that we owe to each other. Yep, social bonds are important. Community is important. Does anybody remember what the Chinese word for ritual is?
Lead.
Yes, li. And what do you gain by practicing li? What do you develop?
Structure?
So the li is the structure. It's the li refers to like not just to specific rituals, but to appropriate social behavior, right?
Isn't that like a sense of community?
Close, yeah. So the word that they use is ren, which means humanity. And humanity covers all of these principles, deference to your superiors, kindness to others, generosity to others, right? Essentially, being good. The goal, right? The person who has cultivated ren or humanity is a junsi or a gentleman. So when Sun Tzu talks about the gentleman in this piece, this is what he means, right? He's referring to this culturally specific idea of a gentleman as someone who lives and practices these Confucian values, right? So ritual is important, appropriate social behavior is important, study is very important, right? Study and education are a very important part of this tradition. Okay, so what's the basic argument that Sun Tzu is making? Yeah.
I have a little post-it here. Since man's nature is evil, it must wait for the instructions of a teacher. Without teachers, man will be inclined to be evil.
Okay, yeah. Human nature is evil is part one, right?
Kind of tying in with that, I had, going forward into it, was that even though the nature of man is evil, human nature is to still seek the good, to be taught, because they're lacking it. So they're always going to seek what they lack.
Well, are we always going to seek what we lack?
Well, not always.
Yeah.
Well, kind of. In his writing, he said if he doesn't have a home, he's going to seek shelter or something along that side. If he doesn't have food, he's going to seek food. And
right.
If he doesn't have the good in him, he's going to seek the good.
But you have to know what it is you're missing, right, in order to seek it. So if we look on page 77, right, you have said someone may object that the sage has arrived where he has through the accumulation of good acts. Why is it then that everyone is not able to accumulate good acts in the same way? I would reply, everyone is capable of doing so, but not everyone can be made to do so. The petty man is capable of becoming a gentleman, yet he is not willing to do so. The gentleman is capable of becoming a petty man, but he is not willing to do so. So, can you force someone to be good?
You can't force anything to change.
Yeah, so someone has to, in order to be a gentleman, right, to become a junsi, right, according to Sun Tzu's argument, you have to want to.
I feel like you can't force somebody to change.
Yeah. Yeah, they have to want to. It has to come from within. So everybody has the capability to do so, right?
Like the old saying, if you can lead a horse to water, you can't make it drink.
Yeah, but you can't make him drink, yeah. Exactly, yeah, you can't, I tried this morning, I poured my dog's breakfast in her bowl, and she just, she wasn't hungry, she didn't want it. I said, Luna, come on, food. Nope, don't want it. Come on, eat your breakfast. And she just, she just wouldn't eat it. I know that if I leave it alone, eventually she'll get hungry and she'll eat it. But yeah, I can't make her. Like, I can't, hold her nose in the bowl and force her to eat it, in part because that would be cruel, right? And in part because, she'll still just, she'll be stubborn and she'll keep her mouth shut, right? So the basic point here is that you can't make somebody follow this path.
It kind of reminds me of, what's the saying, like you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink.
That was what you just pointed out there. Yeah, it's the same basic principle, yeah. You can, so even with a teacher, right? If someone doesn't want to change, if someone doesn't want to be good, despite the fact that they have the capacity to do so, that doesn't mean that they're going to do so, right? They have to actively choose it. So the good is something we have to choose.
I found something in there in my, I guess, opinion of reading that you might be able to share yours on. I don't know if contradicting is the correct term,
Uh-huh.
but it kind of comes up where, a lot of religious sectors, it's pushed as an agenda for control and government,
Uh-huh.
so on and so forth, and that comes up in here. So
Yeah.
I find it, I don't know how to explain it, but he's referring to having those that are enlightened and are already good, but typically, especially throughout history, we see that government has been anything but what they've taught. So he's pushing for the idea of the government and the guidance from the government, but it's not
Okay.
in the same respect of
And-
what he's hoping for.
I think one thing that we need to keep in mind is that when Sun Tzu is writing, there is no effective central government in China. That's fallen apart. And you have all these warlords arguing with each other over who's going to, over who's going to be in control. So oftentimes these kinds of arguments for stability come out of these kinds of turbulent times. You're going to see something similar when we read Thomas Hobbes for next time, right? Hobbes is writing in the context of the English Civil War of the mid-17th century, and arguing that you can't have any kind of civil society without security first, because human beings' natural tendency is to war with each other. So yeah, go ahead.
So like towards the end, he talks about environment.
Uh-huh.
So what I got from it is like what you surround yourself with is how you're gonna act, and like that's how this is what you're gonna do.
Okay, can you point us to the passage?
It's, page 79?
Yeah, like towards the very end.
Mm-hmm.
Although he is not aware of it, he will day by day progress in the practice for the environment. So it's like the very last paragraph in the middle. Because I saw that one too, and
Is that
pretty on point.
is that the one that you meant, Hannah? Is that what you were talking about? Okay, let's look at the whole paragraph and see what we can do. Would you be so kind as to read it for us? Just the last paragraph on page 79. You picked it out for us.
You don't want to read it.
All you got to do is sound out words. That's
I
all.
started to talk. Just go from there. Just halfway through the sentence.
Let me like read the whole thing.
Yes,
The
please.
last paragraph. A man, no matter how fine his nature or how keen his mind, must seek a worthy teacher to study under and good companions to associate with. If he studies under a worthy teacher, he will be able to hear about the ways of Yao,
Shun, you, and Tang, yeah.
and if he associates with good companions, he will be able to observe conduct that is loyal and respectful. Then, although he is not aware of it, he will day by day progress in the practice of benevolence and righteousness, for the environment he is subjected to will cause him to progress. But if a man associates with men who are not good, then he will hear only deceit and lies, and will see only conduct that is marked by wantonness, evil, and greed. Then, although he is not aware of it, he himself will soon be in danger of severe punishment, for the environment he is subjected to will cause him to be in danger. An old text says, if you do not know a man, look at his friends. If you do not know a ruler, look at his attendants. Environment is the important thing, environment is the important thing.
Yes, he often repeats things directly when he thinks they're important, right? So we had the same kind of nature versus nurture thing going on in the Mencius, right? Right, Mencius told that story about Ox Mountain, right, that had been lush and green and thriving until a city was built next to it. And people started, chopping down the trees for wood, hunting the animals for food, things of that nature. And eventually, Ox Mountain, this once thriving ecosystem, was bare, right? So the idea here being that if Ox Mountain hadn't been subjected to these outside forces, it would have remained lush and green. Does Sun Tzu seem to be saying something kind of similar here?
That the environmental effects are, I guess, take their toll, whether it's the landscape or people.
Yeah, he's talking more about people than he is about land, right? Surrounding yourself with the right kind of people, finding the right kind of teacher. But he still seems to be arguing that ultimately nurture can help you overcome nature, right? That if you put yourself in the right kind of environment with the right kind of friends, then it's easier for you to become good. If you choose the wrong kinds of friends, then you will remain evil, right? But I think part of the big point that Sun Tzu is making is that human nature, while it may be evil, can be overcome, which is actually rather similar to the point the Buddha was making, right? That the Buddha argued that it's human nature to strive for what we want, to desire things. But you can, through practice and meditation, overcome that. Sun Tzu is saying something that is quite similar, although his view of human nature is a little darker than the Buddha's is, right? So let's go back to the beginning of this here and talk a little bit about definitions here, because some of the arguments that Sun Tzu is making are coming from a culturally specific perspective. So let's start with the way he sets up the good-evil binary. Let's look at the first paragraph here on page 71. Man's nature is evil. Goodness is the result of conscious activity. The nature of man is such that he is born with a fondness for profit. If he indulges this fondness, it will lead him into wrangling and strife, and all sense of courtesy and humility will disappear. He is born with feelings of envy and hate, and if he indulges these, they will lead him into violence and crime, and all sense of loyalty and good faith will disappear. A man is born with the desires of eyes and ears, with a fondness for beautiful sights and sounds. If he indulges these, they will lead him into license and wantonness, and all ritual principles and correct forms will be lost. Hence, any man who follows his nature and indulges his emotions will inevitably become involved in wrangling and strife, and will violate the forms of society, and will end as a criminal. Therefore, man must be transformed by the instructions of a teacher and guided by ritual principles, and only then will he be able to observe the dictates of courtesy and humility, obey the forms and rules of society, and achieve order. It is obvious from this, then, that man's nature is evil, and that his goodness is the result of conscious activity. So let's sit with this paragraph for a minute, just try to split out from this what sorts of things Sun Tzu associates with evil and what sorts of things he regards as good.
Greed.
Okay, where do we put that? Under what column?
Evil.
Okay. Greed is evil.
Indulging in your emotions.
Okay. Emotional indulgence.
The loyalty and good faith is under the good.
Okay, loyalty and good faith are good.
courtesy, courteous, and humility, but it says he will be able to observe and dictate. So I guess the ability to learn could be kind of sifted out of that and put under good.
Okay, yeah, he talks about finding a teacher as part of the good, right? I think, yeah, courtesy and humility, I think, are things he associates with the good, right? What else does he associate with evil? So, like greed and emotional indulgence.
Envy and hate.
Envy and hate.
The desires of the eyes and ears.
Okay, yep. Sensory pleasures.
Violence and crime.
Violence and crime.
So we get more evil than good.
Well, he believes that human nature is evil, right? And by and large, what he seems to be doing is pairing up the evil thing that humans do naturally and explaining what he thinks is lost if they give in to their nature, right? So that's kind of how we can determine what the good thing is. What do you notice here if we look at the list of good and evil things? What do the good things have in common with each other, and what do the evil things have in common with each other?
Physical for the evil, it seems to be a emotional, physical aspect, and the good are actual acts.
Okay, think about it maybe in terms of who benefits immediately from each, right?
Other people, and good.
Yeah, everything on the good is pro-social behavior, right? Everything in the good is sort of community-oriented. Right, it's all stuff that governs good relations with other people. What about on the evil side? Greed, emotional indulgence, envy, hate, sensory pleasures, violence, crime.
It's like self-oriented.
Yeah, it's very much a self versus community kind of ideology here, right? Community good, self only good when considered in context of the community, right? The community trumps the self. So yeah, evil behavior is selfish behavior. And so, when Sun Tzu says that human nature is evil, what is he saying more specifically about human nature then? Yeah, that human nature is selfish, right? Which is, again, not really too far off from what the Buddha was arguing.
Can that also be kind of considered as acts, like actions that you can do and then carry out? Like you can, I don't know what it's like. It's like selfish action.
Well, I think some of these are closer to feelings, right? So, like envy and hate are feelings that can lead to specific actions, right? You know, I envy you your fancy water bottle. So I hold it against you that you have one and I don't. And I give you lousy grades as a result, right? So envy is the feeling. The action then is what I do as a result of it, right? You know, I hate the sunlight coming in here, so I shut all the blinds selfishly so no one else gets any, right? So the feeling leads to an action. Both the feeling and the action are selfish, right? They show that I'm concerned only with my own comfort and not with yours, right? But yeah, from a Confucian perspective, that which is selfish and individualistic tends to be evil. That which is oriented towards the good of the group tends to be good. And this is something that he has in common with Mencius, right? They believe the same thing here. They would have more or less the same definition of good and evil. They just believe different things about human nature, right? Mencius believes that all things being equal, we will always choose the good.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Would arrogance be underneath the evil?
Certainly, yes. Yeah. Basically, any feeling or thought you would associate with selfishness can be stuck.
Because I was considering what he was saying about, seeking to be taught better and then,
Yeah.
saying, okay, well,
Mhm.
I know I should do this and I'm just not going to do it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think, humility is a big part of this set of values here, right? In part because you do have to be willing to find a teacher, right?
To say you don't know everything or that you can be wrong.
Yeah, like there's a certain level of submission that's required here. So let's continue. If we look at page 72, the paragraph that follows here, right? A warped piece of wood must wait until it has been laid against the straightening board, steamed, and forced into shape before it can become straight. This is a metaphor that's very similar to Mencius's, right, with the willow wood and the cups and bowls. A piece of blunt metal must wait until it has been wetted on a grindstone before it can become sharp. Similarly, since man's nature is evil, it must wait for the instructions of a teacher before it can become upright, and for the guidance of ritual principles before it can become orderly. So let's think about the metaphor here now. This is a multi-layer metaphor here, right? There are a couple of metaphorical terms here. So what are the metaphors we're looking at here? We've got the warped piece of wood, the blunt metal. We've got warped wood and a straightening board. Blunt metal. And a grindstone. So in each of these metaphors, what's the tenor and what's the vehicle? Go ahead.
What is the?
Yeah, actually,
Wait, no,
the-
sorry,
yeah.
the straightening board is wait, hold on, I'm trying to remember what we.
okay, so tenor and
Okay,
vehicle.
So vehicle is how it gets
Yeah,
there.
it's-
So the
it's a-
vehicle would be the straightening board.
Yeah, it's actually a little bit of a trick question, right? Actually, all four of these are vehicles. The tenor is implied in both.
It coming out straight is the implied?
Well,
Or
what is represented by the warped wood and the blunt metal?
Something that's
Man's
like,
nature.
Human nature, yes, good, Serenity. These are both vehicles for human nature. And then, what are the straightening board and the grindstone vehicles for? What is Sun Tzu arguing a person needs in order to pursue? Goodness. Yes, these are vehicles for the instructor. Right? If wood was naturally straight, you wouldn't have to straighten it, right? You wouldn't need the straightening board. If metal was naturally sharp, you wouldn't need the grindstone. But because wood is naturally warped and metal is naturally blunt, then you need some outside influence in order to put it into its proper shape and to make it useful, right? And I think that's the thing we have to remember here. Like, are a piece of warped wood and a piece of blunt metal good for anything?
The only things I can really think of are improper deeds.
Okay.
So,
Yeah, I mean, I guess you could club somebody to death with a piece of blunt metal, right? But that would be evil, right?
that furthers his point.
Yeah, so in order to make either of these into a useful tool, right, you need to apply them, you need to apply something to them. So in order to make a person useful, that person, according to Sun Tzu, needs a teacher, right? Now, Mencius didn't seem to agree with that, or Mencius seemed to think that having a teacher sort of eased the way for you, and might help stop you from falling into bad influences. But it wasn't strictly necessary for the good because people were naturally good anyway. Sun Tzu believes that without a teacher, you will inevitably remain bad. You will remain warped, you will remain blunt.
I don't know what happens if like somebody turns good and they turn bad. Like, would that go against what he says? And I think about that, like you start off good and then something happens and then you end up being bad.
Yeah,
that's
well,
like going from like bad to good.
yeah, I think part of what he says is that like the true junsi, the true gentleman, once your feet are on the path and once you know the way, you won't step off.
People fall off the wagon. I mean, it happens.
Yeah, sure. But I think that he would argue then, well, then they weren't really on the way. That in order to, that provided you do the right things, hang around the right people, put yourself in the right environment, and always think with the good of the group in mind, then you will remain a gentleman, right? You cultivate humanity by engaging in pro-social behavior, and that doesn't just get thrown out or go away, right? That once you have shifted your nature from bad to good, it's likely to stay that way. And if it shifts back, then the shift wasn't sincere or all that strong anyway.
I think you discussed that on 76, that's where I have it on there, but pretty much what you just said I had written down. But it's saying that unless continuously applied rituals and such are not part of someone's nature, and if you continue to do it, it's part of nature.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so yeah, it requires continuous, constant practice to prevent backsliding, right? Yeah, let's see. Where is the? Where is the passage that we were talking about here? Okay, I do want to look actually briefly at the top of page 76 here, right? He's sort of talking about he's making an argument based on history regarding good and bad in human nature, right? So as far as human nature goes, the sages Yao and Hsun possess the same nature as the tyrant Qi or robber Qi, and the gentleman possesses the same nature as the petty man. Would you still maintain then that ritual principles and concerned conscious activity are a part of man's nature? If you do so, then what reason is there to pay any particular honor to Yao, Hsun, or the gentleman? The reason people honor Yao, Hsun, and the gentleman is that they are able to transform their nature, apply themselves to conscious activity, and produce ritual principles. The sage, then, must stand in the same relation to ritual principles as the potter to the things he molds and produces. Looking at it this way, how could ritual principles and concerted conscious activity be a part of man's nature? The reason people despise Chia, robber Qi, or the petty man is that they give free rein to their nature, follow their emotions, and are content to indulge their passions, so that their conduct is marked by greed and contentiousness. Therefore, it is clear that man's nature is evil, and that his goodness is the result of conscious activity. So the basic argument, do we get what the basic argument in this paragraph is? What's he saying?
That you constantly keep up working towards being better to maintain it.
Okay, you have to continue to work to maintain goodness, right? So this is another binary he sets up, is right, conscious activity versus nature.
He also kind of hints on the fact that you'll be successful if you do these things.
Yeah. Yeah, that if you continually practice consciously, well, because again, like think of what the word conscious activity means, right? Conscious means that you've chosen to do it and you're aware that you're doing it, right? So these are things that are not part of our nature. These are things that we learn. And we get better through practice, right? As we continue to practice, we will become better. But if we stop doing these things, then we fall back into our nature, right? And the part of the point he's making here in this paragraph too is that all humans must have the same nature, right? If there is such a thing as human nature, then it must be the same for everybody. Which means that it's the same for these famous sages as it is for these famous criminals.
Which I didn't understand that.
Well, okay, so the point there is that, so which is more likely to be the natural human state, right? The state of the learned sage who practices benevolence through ritual, through learning, through study, or the robber who indulges his emotions and his passions and just does whatever the hell he wants. Which one is more likely to be following human nature?
It's a crappy dude robbing the neighbor.
Yeah. The person who's just doing whatever feels good to him, right?
There was somewhere I read, and I can't remember where it was in here, but he was essentially to explain sages, because it came up in there, so how do you explain sages? And he was like, well, simply just the fact that they're not us.
Okay, so does everybody understand what he means by a sage?
It's one of the
Okay.
older. No.
Okay.
I only know video game sages.
So, okay, in a video game, what is a sage?
He's the one that you go to for your questions, your teachings, your help, any help.
Yeah,
Kind of
this-
the witch doctor.
Yeah, the sage is
Dad combined.
the sage is the person who knows shit, right? And yeah, that's exactly what he means
A lot of
here
times
by
they're
a
village
sage.
leaders.
Yeah, maybe not like political leaders in this case, but yeah, a sage is an extremely learned person, right? Someone who has learned to follow the way, right? And so is, as a result, kind of an ideal teacher, right? So part of the argument he's making is to follow the ways of the sage, right? Not the ways of the petty man or Robert G. or these other figures from culture and history who behave selfishly, right? The sage is basically exactly what you said it was, yeah. That is what he means by sage. But one gets to be a sage in Confucianism through that very specific process, right? So, you become a gentleman first, and then kind of like the senior gentlemen are sages. So he also sets up a binary between the gentleman and the petty man, right? Right, one associated with good and the other associated with evil. Let me see where the hell does he define that? Well, I seem to be unable to locate it right now. We can come back to that later, but yeah, this is, let's look instead on page 73 near the bottom of the page. Someone may ask, if man's nature is evil, then where do ritual principles come from? I would reply, all ritual principles are produced by the conscious activity of the sages. Essentially, they are not products of man's nature. A potter molds clay and makes a vessel. but the vessel is the product of the conscious activity of the potter, not essentially a product of human nature. A carpenter carves a piece of wood and makes a utensil, but the utensil is the product of the conscious activity of the carpenter, not essentially a product of his human nature. The sage gathers together his thoughts and ideas, experiments with various forms of conscious activity, and so produces ritual principles and sets forth laws and regulations. Hence, these ritual principles and laws are the products of the conscious activity of the sage, not essentially products of his human nature. So how is the sage like a potter or a carpenter?
He's molding and creating.
Okay, yes. He is doing those things. What is he molding or creating?
People to be better.
What is he molding and creating in order for people to be better? What is the thing specifically that the sage makes?
Themselves.
You're getting it closer, right? What does it say in the paragraph?
Well, this is, I think, the paragraph that I read that I was like really confused on, because it's saying that the sage doesn't exist, but the sage exists.
Thoughts in that.
Yeah, thoughts and ideas, laws and rituals, right? The sage is the one who creates the laws and rituals. And how is this like a potter making a vessel or a carpenter making whatever the hell, or a carpenter carving a piece of wood?
They're whittling away at it.
Are potters and carpenters born knowing how to work their trade? It's learned activity, right? You have to learn how to work a potter's wheel and how to fire a vessel, right? All the elements of pottery. You have to learn how to carve a piece of wood, how to join it together to others, right?
Typically, it's from like a mentor or a sage, right?
Yeah, and a mentor usually has to show you how to do it, right? You know, because you might figure it out on your own, but if so, there are going to be a lot of accidents along the way, right? Perhaps some injuries. So the sage produces laws and rituals in the way that a potter and a carpenter produce the goods they create, right? But yeah, part of the point here is that it's not their nature to do so. It's their profession to do so. So it is conscious activity. It is conscious activity and it must be learned.
Maybe the wrong class for this question, but who's to say they were right?
Well, what we're trying to do right now is to read the text sympathetically, right? So, you don't have to buy it, right? You don't have to believe it. But you do need to understand it, right? We do need to make sure that we get where it's coming from before trying to make any kinds of arguments against it, right? So what I'm trying to do initially, at least, is go through all of these texts that we're looking at, just with an eye towards being able to restate the arguments fairly, right? Be able to pick them apart and restate them fairly. All right, so anything else that we need to pull out of here? So let's try to apply this to the theory of education that we've been working with here, right? So how do you think Sun Tzu would define education? What for him does it mean to be educated?
Enlightened.
Well,
I know I've said that word like
yeah,
5 times,
and
but
the-
it's kind of a big
yeah,
picture
but I mean,
thing.
the problem there is that you're kind of just substituting another word, right? So let's try to think about what it means to be educated or enlightened here.
Like knowing the right path and not giving like to your selfishness.
to know the good, right? And to choose it. Right? To choose the good over the evil. Right? Despite our nature.
This may be a cop-out answer, but to follow the child.
And the Tao or the Way is defined differently in different Chinese traditions. Right? So a Taoist, for example, views the Way very differently from a Confucianist. We're not looking at any Taoist texts, I don't think. But yeah, the Tao for a Confucian would be something more like this, right? So to choose the good of the group generally, and to perform proper ritual behavior. So then, what does it mean? What do we think he means by knowledge? Or how do you think what do you think we would associate this text with knowledge?
Conscious activity.
Yeah, conscious activity, right? Things that we learn to do to make us better, right? Conscious activity right, implies both knowledge and choice. Along with practice, right? So we learn information. That information helps us to be good. And we have to continually practice in order to maintain that goodness, right?
Can you also say like you need to know the aspects of human nature and know like what's evil so you know not to be evil?
Yeah, you need to know what's good and what's evil. You need to know the difference between good and evil. So that you can practice goodness. And I think that ritual is also a component to this, right? You need to know what the proper social forms and social behaviors are in order to become better. Now, what about the process by which this happens? How does one become educated? This should actually be fairly simple to answer, right?
First, you have to choose to be educated.
Yep. Okay. You gotta make a conscious choice.
And then you have to seek it.
You have to like learn from the sage.
Yeah, you need a teacher, right? You need to choose to become good, and you need someone to show you the way. You need someone to teach you how to do it. So you make a conscious choice, you get a teacher, and you practice the hell out of it, right? And what about the purpose of education? And think about this not just for the individual, right? But what seems to be the overall purpose of Sun Tzu's concept of education?
Be a better person to other people.
And in order to do that, what do we have to overcome?
Ourselves.
Yeah, we have to overcome our own nature, right? So the purpose of education is to overcome our evil nature.
Can you also like tie community into it?
Yep. Overcome our evil nature for the good of society, yeah. According to this model, everything's better when we're not selfish, right? Everyone is better when we're not selfish. Okay, so that's really about all I have for you, so I'll let you go a little bit early. So we'll pick this up with Thomas Hobbes next time. And again, like I said, just like go slowly and carefully with it. You'll probably find the arguments a little bit similar sometimes to Sun Tzu, but he is also coming from probably a more directly authoritarian perspective.